Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this important announcement. My name is Nicholas Marcus Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Black Class Action Secretariat. I want to thank you, the members of the press, for being here today. I also want to thank our partners in this pursuit of justice, Amnesty International Canada, English-speaking branch, for their work in making today's announcement possible. We are grateful to be joined today by the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, as well as Canada's New Democratic Party, represented by both Leader Jagmeet Singh, as well as Member of Parliament for Hamilton Centre, Matthew Green. I would also like to acknowledge the challenge that many Atlantic Canadians are facing today. We join with all Canadians in sending them our best wishes. Finally, we're speaking to you today during the National Week of Truth and Reconciliation. We are committed to doing what we can in our daily lives to support true reconciliation. As you may know, the Black Class Action Secretariat is a non-profit organization leading a monumental legal case against the Government of Canada. We're seeking justice for thousands of Black Canadians who have been excluded from Canada's public service and those who gained entry only to experience economic and psychological hardship as a result of systemic anti-Black racism and Black employee exclusion. For decades, Black public service employees have experienced all forms of racism, both covert and overt. Our members can readily recount instances of name-calling and racial slurs in the workplace, of not being hired or never being promoted, and always being excluded from the basic human rights in the workplace. Black Canadians continue to experience anti-Black hate and anti-Black racism within Canada's public service. Knowing this, the government continues to drag its feet and battle Black Canadians in court. We cannot tolerate this anymore. Enough is enough. Therefore, today, we're announcing, in partnership with Amnesty International Canada, the filing of a complaint to the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This complaint details systemic anti-Black racism in hiring and promotion within Canada's federal public service, and seeks to have the Special Rapporteur investigate and issue a formal communication that calls on Canada to meet its international obligations under the various UN treaties, conventions, and declarations to which Canada is a party, to establish a plan to increase opportunities for Black Canadian women within the workforce that will include targets, training opportunities, and methods of accountability, and in general to establish a plan to meet specific targets in hiring and promoting Black Canadian workers. And finally, to initiate a study and report on systemic discrimination in labor and employment with a particular and unvarnished focus on the racial stratification of the Canadian public service and the true reality of why this culture exists. With this complaint, we are elevating Canada's past failures and failure to act in the present to an international body. With that complaint, we are reaffirming that the Government of Canada needs to be held accountable, and we are letting our members know that we'll do whatever that needs to be done to ensure their suffering is adequately addressed. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Ketty Nivyabandi, Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada in an English-speaking branch.
Thank you, Nicholas, and good afternoon, everybody. So I am the Secretary General for Amnesty International Canada. And so I'm here today on behalf of Amnesty International to express our support of the Black Class Action's complaint to the United Nations regarding systemic anti-Black discrimination in Canada and Canadian federal public service. The complaint that the Black Class Action Secretariat has put forward to the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, as well as the UN Working Group on People of African Descent, alleges that former, current, and prospective Black employees have been denied hiring and promotional opportunities because of their race. These denials violate Canada's international human rights commitments, including the right to non-discrimination, which is found in multiple international conventions that Canada has ratified. There are very specific recognitions of this right in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, including the right to equal opportunity to be promoted based only on seniority and competence, and equal remuneration for work of equal value. Therefore, under international law, Canada has a positive obligation to address discrimination. This means that Canada must take special and concrete measures to eliminate discrimination in employment. Although Canada's Employment Equity Act aims to achieve this equality, it only recognizes 4 designated groups: women, Aboriginal peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minorities. Grouping all visible minorities together renders the unique and intersecting forms of discrimination faced by Black employees invisible. We recognize that Canada has launched a task force to review this legislation in July 2021, which is a positive step, but this is not enough. We are particularly concerned by the gendered dimension of racial discrimination in Canada's public service. Indeed, 70% of public workers who have come forward through the Black Class Action are women, Black women. And this is contrary to the feminist commitments made by the Canadian government. Black women, past and present, continue to pay the highest cost for their dedication and lifelong careers in the public service. As many have alleged in this case, they often retire broken and broke in a system they have served their entire lives, but which has failed to serve them in return. Canada's obligations to gender equality are non-partisan, and they go beyond its own domestic commitments. The Canadian government is obligated under international law, and specifically under Article 11 of the CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, to take up all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the employment sector. The UN Working Group, which I referred to earlier, has already stressed that Black women in Canada are particularly vulnerable to marginalization, and the discriminations they face based on gender and race intersect and they compound discrimination. We also know that racial discrimination affects women differently than men, as this easily goes undetected and women often lack access to remedies or complaint mechanisms. This is an issue that extends beyond the scope of Canada. And as the world's leading international human rights organization, we are committed to support Black workers and Black women workers in the pursuit of justice and fair treatment in the public service. As I mentioned earlier, Canada is obligated under international law to provide effective remedies against acts of racial discrimination. The right to an effective remedy includes a duty of non-repetition, and we therefore call on the Canadian government to take decisive measures without delay and work with Black workers to enact the systemic change that is long overdue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ketty. And now I'd like to call on Norma, who is the Vice President for the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada. Norma Domey, please.
Good afternoon.
The Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada has for many years worked to raise awareness, provided support to our members across the country, and collaborated with employers to remove barriers for Black Canadians in the workplace. Legislative changes are needed, including amendments to the Employment Equity Act, in order to ensure Black public servants are not left behind in the hiring and in the promotional opportunities. A commission must be put in place to ensure accountability in employment practices for public servants. You can count on our union, the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, to always work hard on this priority. That's why we strongly support this Black Class Action suit by the Secretariat, this complaint before the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Norma. I'd now like to call on the leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada, Jagmeet Singh, to share a few remarks.
I want to thank Mr. Thompson and thank our guest that spoke so eloquently. I'm joined here, of course, with by the Member of Parliament for Hamilton Centre, Matthew Green, who's been a fierce advocate for justice broadly and in particular challenging anti-Black racism and in fighting towards building a more equitable society. On behalf of all New Democrats, as leader of the party, I want to express my full solidarity with the Black Class Action Secretariat. Their call for justice in this case, their call for equity in this case is something we fully support. It is clear by the evidence they've raised that there's examples of ongoing and historic discrimination faced by Black federal employees. As was mentioned by Amnesty International, the specific gendered nature of that discrimination is particularly appalling, as is the fact that this liberal government continues to say one thing to Black Canadians and then do another when it comes down to it, and the fact that this liberal government is opposing the steps taken, creating barriers and opposing the steps taken by the Black Class Action Secretariat to move towards justice. So we, in full terms, support the call and will be providing any support that we can to advance this cause for justice. Donc je veux dire aujourd'hui qu'au nom de tous les néo-démocrates, comme chef du parti, je suis ici avec le député de Hamilton Centre, Matthew Green, et quelqu'un qui est une fierce avocat, une fierce défendeur de la justice, quelqu'un qui continue de faire face à les inégalités. Et on appuie absolument les demandes aujourd'hui pour la justice pour les travailleurs de la communauté noire au niveau fédéral. C'est clair que ce gouvernement libéral dit une chose aux communautés et fait les opposés. Donc, on est ici pour appuyer les demandes pour la justice, pour l'équité, pour l'égalité, et on va assister comme un allié, comme on peut. Encore, je suis tellement reconnaissant du travail fait par le secrétariat, comment c'est difficile, et on est là avec plein de solidarité pour demander la justice. Merci.
We'll now start the question period. We'll start with the questions in the room before moving on to Zoom.
Should have indicated that. Thank you.
Oh,
yes.
Et on va prendre les questions dans la salle avant d'aller sur Zoom. I invite the reporters on Zoom to use the raise hand functions if you have any questions.
Hey, Dave Fraser, Canadian Press. Perhaps somebody from the class action lawsuit could explain the rationale for elevating to the UN and not waiting for the federal court process to play out.
Sure. The reason why we're elevating this issue is because Canada continues to delay. It continues to utilize its vast resources to deny Black workers in the court. the class action was scheduled to, the certification hearing was scheduled to begin on September 21st. That has been delayed. They're seeking another extension, although they have had our certification record since last May. They have now hired a United States expert to challenge their very own data. So delays like that, when the government has those resources and had the claim since last year, hiring an expert at the last minute and a United States expert, not a Canadian expert, to analyze its very own data that it has provided for the case, it has demonstrated to us that the government is clearly not acting in good faith on this issue, and Black Canadians are going to wait a very long time for justice within Canada. So we have turned to the international community to hold Canada accountable to its international obligations.
Thank you. And then for Mr. Singh, next month, the provincial NDP in Saskatchewan will be holding their convention. They've asked you not to come and just send a video message. I'm wondering, what is your response to not being invited? And what do you think you need to do as the federal leader to maintain support of provincial parties like the Saskatchewan NDP? Thank you.
We indicated early on that there was that is the evening of the press gallery dinner where all leaders will be attending. I will be attending, so we conveyed that information very early on that I was unable to attend in person, but I was very happy to send a video message, and I'm happy to be able to send that message. I was able to visit Saskatoon earlier in the summer in June. Had an excellent visit. A number of supporters came out to a number of events. I also spoke with the leader who is newly elected and is going to provide an excellent leadership in the province of Saskatchewan. We know that there are a number of concerns in Saskatchewan around the future of workers. We have been conducting a lot of work around speaking directly with energy workers and making sure any steps to tackle the climate crisis centers workers in that work, and that's something that we're committed to. We're also the only party right now that's proposing real solutions to deal with the cost of living increases. Neither the Conservatives have actually done anything concretely to make life better, and the Liberals have been forced by us to deliver on things like making sure kids under 12 get dental care, making sure that we send more of people's own money back in their pockets with a GST rebate, and by helping people who are renting with some more respect and dignity and providing additional supports there. So we're delivering concrete supports to workers, and we'll continue to speak directly to energy workers that you are immensely important and deserve to have jobs that are here for the long term. And we're committed to fighting to make sure those jobs are there in sectors that are going to have that long-term capacity to reduce our emissions and create good jobs for you and your families.
Hi, Cheryl Evelyn, The Hill Times. I'm not sure if this is a question for Nicholas or Mr. Singh, but in taking this to the UN, how much, I guess, confidence do you have that this is going to generate the type of action and reaction from the government that you're looking for, given, I suppose, a lack of action on other issues that have been taken and filed in terms of complaints with the UN and other special rapporteurs and complaints, especially with regards to Indigenous peoples in this country?
Thank you for your question. We recognize the challenges that are ahead. We recognize the challenges with this complaint and the time that it may take to be resolved. But more importantly, what we're doing here is elevating and giving an international voice to Black workers in Canada and raising with the international community how Canada treats Black people. And we believe that there's significant value in that and making the international community aware of these human rights violations that Canada calls on other countries to uphold. So we're bringing this to the international community, not only to the United Nations, but to the international community, so that the government has to know that, you know, everyone is paying attention. There must be accountability for these violations.
And on the front of legislative changes, obviously in the last parliament, Selena Cesar Chavin, she put forward a private member's bill to address some of these issues. Maybe for Mr. Singh or Mr. Green, has there been any thought to, taking a concerted effort that if the government isn't going to act, that there would be, some legislative push from within your own party, given that you're supporting this action?
Our approach is to be an ally for the Black Class Action Secretariat in supporting their wishes in terms of how to move forward. We are open to using all tools that we have at our disposal to advance this. It's a question of justice. It's a question of justice for Black workers. It's clear, based on the evidence, that Black workers at the federal level have been and continue to be discriminated against. And we want to see justice here. We want to see fairness. We want to see that this discrimination ends. And to that extent, we are in support of the Black Action Secretariat and their calls, and we're open to other legislative potential solutions. But I want to be clear, the government that is opposing this in court is the government, obviously, in the House, in the chambers. This is the Liberal government that's deciding and directing the response. If they're putting up these barriers at the justice level, at the jurisprudence level, it's clear that the judicial level, it's clear that they're not in support of this, and so we'll continue to apply pressure. We support the step to elevate it to the international domain, so that not just Amnesty, not just the United Nations, but the world can see that Canada has a lot more work to do. I think it's important that the Liberal government hear this message loud and clear. It doesn't need to get to this point. They can respond, they can stop putting up barriers, and they can walk the walk instead of just talking about it. They can deliver, and we're here to support that.
Excusez-moi, est-ce que c'est possible d'avoir la réponse en français?
Oui, bien sûr, bien sûr. Donc, c'est clair que ce gouvernement libéral a créé des barrières parce que c'est le gouvernement qui gère la poursuite en justice. Et c'est clair par rapport au secrétariat que le gouvernement prend des gestes pour ralentir le processus de justice. Ça, c'est un problème. On est ouvert à utiliser tous les outils qu'on a pour aider et appuyer le secrétariat, mais notre but, c'est d'être un allié. Donc, on va suivre les conseils de cette secrétariat pour les aider. C'est clair, et on doit dire encore que le Canada, dans ce cas, le gouvernement libéral, continue de discriminer la communauté noire au niveau fédéral dans le domaine du travail, et ça doit arrêter. On demande la justice et on appuie la demande du secrétariat. Merci.
Ma question serait pour M. Marcus Thompson. Parlez-vous français? Hein? Non? D'accord. Est-ce qu'un d'entre vous parle français? Par M. Singh, évidemment.
Non, M. Thompson va donner une explication. Donnez-moi un instant.
Okay.
Sure, there is a contact spokesperson that we're happy to connect you with afterwards for your question.
Okay, perfect. I'd just like maybe one small question in English then, and can ask my other question to your contact. Was wondering if you go now to the UN, is that you have put some distrust in the Canadian judicial process?
So this process is completely separate from that. It is not reliant on the other. We continue to have with regards to there's different parts of this justice system here, and the delay is not necessarily the justice system. It is the government of Canada that is creating these delays, that is acknowledging in public domain that these issues exist in all institutions and the damages that it causes is real, as well as creating a mental health fund to address that, and is opposing Black workers in court with countless lawyers. And we've attempted many times to have dialogue on this issue, and the government has refused to do so, but only to use the justice system to delay and deny Black workers. And that's why we've elevated this to the international human rights body.
Doesn't it usually needs to wait up until all the judicial actions have been taken and remedied in Canada before?
Not through the special rapporteur.
We'll now take a few questions on Zoom. First questions is Gizioli, City News. Xiaoli, you are unmuted. You are welcome to ask your question.
Or outcome of the class action.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, with respect to this UN complaint, is there any hope that this complaint, this elevation, will have a material change on the progress or the outcome of the class action?
We welcome any positive outcomes that this effort may have on the legal action, but this is really about justice for thousands of workers, not only those who were hired and never promoted, but those who were never hired in the first place on account of their race. So we would welcome any positive outcome on the legal action, but this is a separate effort to bring justice to thousands of workers within Canada's public service.
And follow up for Ms. Domey, the reference you made earlier to legislative change to address this inequity, could I have some more specifics? Were you talking about maybe an alteration to the Employment Equity Act identifying Black Canadians as a group that faces specific discrimination, or what would that look like in your view?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion, thank you for the question, on just that, what needs to be done so that we are not lost in the group of equity-seeking employees. We've already, several years ago, asked for disaggregating data so that we can see and government can see where the problems lie and start developing policies and legislation. It's been known for many years that the Employment Equity Act, which is decades old, needs to be amended and brought up to date. So these are some of the things that we're looking into. The policies need to be developed, legislation needs to be changed, current legislation needs to be amended. There's a lot of work to do.
Prochaine question est Rémi Autier, Radio-Canada.
Hello, my first question would be to the representative of Amnesty International Canada. You said that, I'm not sure I picked that up perfectly, that only half of Amnesty International is represented here. How come this is only through the English speaking? A lot of French speaking federal employees are Black employees. How come this is not a united effort by the whole Amnesty International?
If you could just clarify the 50% part of your question.
I maybe misunderstood you when you started. You said that you represented half of Amnesty International. I'm just wondering if the whole of Amnesty International is behind this effort, or is it only the English-speaking branch? You represented the English-speaking branch speaker and not for the French branch. I'm wondering what part the French branch has here.
Yes, so the work we've been doing with the Black Class Action has been led certainly by the English-speaking section, and that's the section that was approached. But the submission we've put forward is from Amnesty International, and it's been also put forward. We submitted a letter in support of this complaint via our New York office, and so therefore it certainly is. We're speaking for all Canadians across the board.
My other question is something you mentioned. I don't know if Mr. Thompson would speak to it, or if you would. You said that the fact that the Canada Employment Equity Act targets 4 groups, women, visible minorities, Aboriginal, and people with a handicap. This indicates that the fact that Black people are included in all visible minorities dilute the experience. I'm wondering how you can come to that conclusion, and why is this action not targeting other groups that have been discriminated?
So if your question is whether having people of African descent explicitly identified within the Employment Equity Act, we believe it is fundamental in order to, as a previous speaker highlighted, in order first to measure their experience and second to address it. Now, this does not mean by any means that other minorities should also not be identified. It is our hope that the Government of Canada will take this opportunity to fully review the Employment Equity Act, not only in the advantage in favor of Black workers, but all workers who are from minority groups across Canada.
So just to understand, so you're saying that it should be every minority group should be mentioned in the Employment Equity Act, or is there only a separate group for Black employees, or because you seem to say there's a problem with all visible minorities except, of course, Aboriginal in the actual wording?
We are currently urging the Canadian government to fully review the Employment Equity Act in accordance to the demographics of its employees. We're highlighting the specific and unique challenges faced by Black workers because they are the most impacted if you've read the documents put forward by the Black Class Action, they are indeed the most impacted and the most invisibilized within the visible minority. So they're the invisible minority within the visible minorities. And this is why we are highlighting and stressing that specific measures need to be put in place for Black workers. That does not mean the exclusion or the non-respect of the human rights of the other minorities. I hope that clarifies the question you posed.
Thank you.
It seems that we have a few more minutes. Are there any other questions in the room?
So you're here today, obviously, with the NDP. Have you had any outreach from any of the other parties, the Parliamentary Black Caucus in general, the Liberal Black Caucus? Obviously, they are members of the government, but
over the past, thank you for your question. Over the past 2 years, we have reached out to members of Parliament across the board, as we recognize this is a nonpartisan issue. The NDP has, we reached out to the NDP as the Labour Party, and as this concerned many workers in the Labour movement, and their leader, Jagmeet Singh, agreed to support this initiative. But we have met with members of the Liberal government in the past. We met with members of Parliament from across the board to trying to work together, and the NDP is here to support us today, and we welcome support from other parties on this important issue. Let's work together to address this non-partisan issue. That's my message.
thank you.
This concludes the press conference then. Merci beaucoup.